Have you ever felt like you were living someone else's life? Like you were playing a role in a play you didn't write? That's how Alexander felt. He had it all: the sprawling penthouse overlooking Central Park, the tailored suits that cost more than most people's rent, the private jet on standby. He was a tech billionaire, a name whispered in boardrooms with a mix of awe and envy. He'd built an empire from lines of code, a digital world where he was king. But in the quiet moments, when the city lights twinkled like fallen stars outside his window, Alexander felt a profound emptiness. It was a hollowness that even the roar of his Ferrari couldn't fill. Alexander's life was a whirlwind of deals, deadlines, and dazzling presentations. He was a master of the universe, a titan of industry. He could predict market trends, anticipate technological leaps, and close deals before the ink was dry. He was a force to be reckoned with, a man who commanded attention and respect. But behind the steely gaze and the confident smile, there was a quiet longing, a yearning for something more. He'd buried it deep, beneath layers of ambition and achievement, convincing himself that success was the ultimate goal. But deep down, he knew something was missing. His days were a blur of meetings, conferences, and international flights. He jet-set across the globe, closing deals in London one day, presenting in Tokyo the next. He dined with presidents, schmoozed with celebrities, and was photographed with supermodels. His life was a highlight reel of glamour and power. Yet, amidst the glitz and the glamour, Alexander felt strangely disconnected. He was living a life that looked perfect on paper, but felt hollow in his heart. One evening, after a particularly grueling round of negotiations, Alexander found himself alone in his penthouse. The city lights twinkled below, a million tiny stories unfolding in the vast urban landscape. He poured himself a glass of expensive scotch, the amber liquid swirling in the crystal tumbler. He looked out at the city, at the sprawling metropolis he had conquered, and he felt a pang of loneliness so sharp it took his breath away. He had everything the world could offer, yet he felt utterly alone. His phone rang, a jarring intrusion into his solitude. He almost didn't answer, but something compelled him to pick up. It was his sister, Clara. Her voice was strained, barely a whisper. "Alexander," she began, her voice trembling, it's about Lily." "Lily?" "His niece. A bright, bubbly little girl with a smile that could melt glaciers." Alexander adored Lily. She was a ray of sunshine in his otherwise sterile world. He'd always made time for her, despite his demanding schedule. He'd take her to the park, read her stories, and indulge her every whim. Lily was the one person who could make him forget, even for a little while, the weight of the world on his shoulders. Clara's words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken sorrow. Alexander's heart pounded in his chest. "What about Lily?" he asked, his voice tight with anxiety. Clara took a shaky breath. "There's been an accident, Alexander," she said, her voice choked with tears. "Her parents, they didn't make it." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Alexander felt a coldness spread through him, a numbness that threatened to consume him. He couldn't speak. He could barely breathe. His brother and sister-in-law gone? Just like that? And Lily an orphan? Clara continued, her voice breaking. "Lily, she's with me now. But, Alexander, I don't know what to do. I have my own family. I just don't know if I can." Alexander didn't let her finish. "I'll take her," he said, his voice firm, resolute. "I'll take care of her." The words were out before he even had time to think. He didn't hesitate. He didn't consider the implications. All he knew was that Lily needed him, and he would be there for her. The next few weeks were a blur. The world of high-stakes deals and billion-dollar mergers faded into the background. Alexander's focus shifted, completely and utterly, to Lily. He moved her into his penthouse, transforming the sleek, minimalist space into a home. He hired a nanny, a warm, gentle woman named Anya, who quickly became a second mother to Lily. He learned about bedtime stories, lunchbox snacks, and the intricacies of princess dresses. He was a tech billionaire, yes, but now he was also a father. It wasn't easy. Alexander was used to a life of order and control. His days were meticulously planned, his schedule dictated by meetings and deadlines. Now, his life revolved around Lily's needs, her tantrums, her laughter, her tears. It was chaotic, messy, and utterly terrifying. But it was also the most rewarding thing he had ever done. He learned to navigate the world of playdates and school lunches. He discovered the joy of building sandcastles and the frustration of untangling Barbie doll hair. He learned to listen, really listen, to the stories Lily told, the dreams she shared. He was no longer just Alexander the tech billionaire. He was Alexander, Lily's father. The change in him was palpable. His sharp edges softened. His steely gaze became warmer. The emptiness that had haunted him for so long began to recede, replaced by a feeling he hadn't known he was capable of love. Unconditional, all-consuming love. He still went to work, of course. He still ran his empire. But his priorities had shifted. Work was no longer the center of his universe. It was a means to an end. It was what allowed him to provide for Lily, to give her the life she deserved. One day, Alexander was sitting in his office, reviewing a particularly complex contract. He was distracted, though, his mind wandering to Lily. He was planning her birthday party, a princess-themed extravaganza that he knew she would love. He smiled to himself, imagining her face when she saw the decorations, the cake, the presents. His assistant, a young man named Ben, knocked on his door. "Mr. Sterling," he said, "there's a situation." Alexander sighed. He was used to situations. They were a constant in his life. Usually, they involved some kind of corporate crisis, a hostile takeover, or a PR nightmare. He braced himself for the worst. "What is it, Ben?" he asked, his voice weary. Ben hesitated. It's about Lily," he stammered. Alexander's heart skipped a beat. "What about Lily?" he asked, his voice sharp. She's been taken," Ben said, his voice barely above a whisper. Alexander stared at him, his mind reeling. "Taken?" he repeated, his voice hollow. "What do you mean, taken?" Ben explained, his words tumbling over each other. Lily had been at the park with Anya when a car pulled up. Two men got out, grabbed Lily, and drove away. Anya had tried to stop them, but they had pushed her aside. She was shaken, but unharmed. Alexander felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal fear he had never experienced before. His daughter, his Lily, had been kidnapped. He felt a rage so intense it threatened to consume him. He would find them. He would find whoever had taken his daughter, and he would make them pay. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "Get me my security team," he barked. "I want every resource at our disposal focused on finding Lily. I want every street, every alley, every house in the city searched. I want those men found, and I want my daughter back." He stormed out of his office, his mind racing. Who would do this? Who would dare to take his daughter? He thought of his rivals, his enemies, the people he had crossed in his climb to the top. Could it be them? A twisted act of revenge? Or was it something else? Something more sinister? He felt a wave of panic wash over him. He couldn't breathe. He had to find her. He had to get her back. He would do anything, pay anything, to have her safe in his arms again. He arrived at the park, the scene of the crime. Police cars were everywhere, their flashing lights illuminating the playground. Anya was talking to the police, her face pale and drawn. Alexander rushed to her side. "Anya, what happened?" he asked, his voice trembling. Anya burst into tears. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Sterling," she sobbed. "I tried to stop them, but they were too strong. They just took her." Alexander held her hand, trying to comfort her. "It's okay, Anya," he said. "It's okay," he repeated, though his own heart was breaking. "You did everything you could." He turned to the police officer, a tall, imposing man with a stern face. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Why aren't you out there looking for her?" The officer explained that they were following protocol, gathering information, interviewing witnesses. They assured Alexander that they were doing everything they could. But Alexander wasn't satisfied. He couldn't wait. He had to find Lily himself. He pulled out his phone and called his head of security, a former officer named Dmitri. "Dmitri," he said, his voice urgent, "I need you here. Now. Lily's been taken." Dmitri arrived within minutes, a whirlwind of efficiency and action. He assessed the situation, spoke to the police, and then turned to Alexander. "Mr. Sterling," he said, "we'll find her? I promise you." Dmitri and his team fanned out across the city, following every lead, no matter how small. They checked security cameras, interviewed witnesses, and tracked down every possible connection. Alexander stayed at the park, his mind a whirlwind of fear and desperation. He couldn't shake the image of Lily's face, her bright smile, her sparkling eyes. He imagined her scared, alone, calling for him. The thought was unbearable. He paced back and forth, his anxiety growing with each passing minute. He felt helpless, powerless. He was used to being in control, to making things happen. But this was different. This was beyond his control. As the hours ticked by, Alexander's hope began to dwindle. He thought of all the things he hadn't said to Lily, all the moments he had taken for granted. He regretted every missed bedtime story, every rushed goodbye. He vowed that if he got her back, he would never take her for granted again. Dmitri returned, his face grim. "We found the car, Mr. Sterling," he said. "It was abandoned in an alleyway downtown." Alexander's heart sank. They had found the car, but not Lily. "Anything?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dmitri shook his head. "Nothing. The car was wiped clean. No fingerprints, no clues." Alexander felt a wave of despair wash over him. He was losing hope. He felt like he was drowning in a sea of fear and uncertainty. He didn't know what to do. He went back to his penthouse, the silence echoing through the empty rooms. Lily's toys were scattered on the floor, a reminder of her presence, a testament to the joy she had brought into his life. He picked up her favorite doll, a ragged princess with a missing arm, and held it close to his chest. He closed his eyes, trying to conjure up her image, trying to hear her laughter. He sat down on the couch, the doll still clutched in his hand, and stared out at the city lights. The city that had once been his kingdom now felt like a prison. He was trapped, helpless, at the mercy of whoever had taken his daughter. He thought about his life, the life he had built for himself. The money, the power, the success, it all seemed meaningless now. What was the point of having everything if he didn't have Lily? He thought about his brother and sister-in-law, Lily's parents. They were gone, taken too soon. And now, Lily was gone too. He felt a pang of guilt. He had promised to take care of her, to protect her. And he had failed. He stayed up all night, waiting, hoping, praying. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. He couldn't even think straight. His mind was consumed by thoughts of Lily, by images of her being scared, alone, in danger. As dawn broke, Alexander felt a sense of dread he had never experienced before. He knew that time was running out. He had to find her, and he had to find her soon. He called Dmitri again. "Anything?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Dmitri's voice was grim. "Nothing, Mr. Sterling. We've hit a dead end." Alexander felt his world crumble around him. He had nowhere to turn. He was alone. He was helpless. He was lost. He decided to go back to the park, the place where it had all happened. He needed to be there, to retrace his steps, to try to find some clue, some hint, some anything that could lead him to Lily. He walked through the park, his eyes scanning the ground, searching for anything out of the ordinary. He looked at the swings, the slides, the sandbox, the places where Lily had played, the places where he had been happy. He sat down on a bench, the same bench where he had sat with Lily just a few days ago. He closed his eyes, trying to remember her laughter, her smile, the sound of her voice. Suddenly, he heard a noise, a faint sound coming from the woods behind the playground. He opened his eyes, his heart pounding. He listened carefully. The sound came again, a muffled sob. He stood up, his senses on high alert. He followed the sound, his footsteps silent on the soft earth. The sobs grew louder, more distinct. He could hear a child crying. He pushed through the trees, his heart pounding in his chest. And then he saw her. Lily. She was sitting on the ground, huddled against a tree, her face buried in her hands. She was crying softly, her small body shaking. Alexander rushed to her side. "Lily!" he cried, his voice choked with emotion. She looked up, her eyes wide with fear. "Daddy?" she whispered. He scooped her up into his arms, holding her tight, burying his face in her hair. "I'm here, baby," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm here. I'll never leave you again." He held her close, feeling the warmth of her body against his. He had found her. He had his Lily back. He carried her out of the woods, back to the playground, back to the light. He didn't let her go. He held her tight, afraid that if he let her go, she would disappear again. He saw Dmitri and his team waiting for him. They looked relieved, exhausted. They had been searching all night. Alexander nodded to them, a silent thank you. He didn't need to say anything. They knew what he was thinking. He took Lily back to his penthouse, back to her room, back to her toys. He tucked her into bed, kissed her forehead, and told her he loved her. He sat beside her bed, watching her sleep, listening to her soft breathing. He didn't leave her side. He stayed there all night, watching over her, making sure she was safe. He knew that the nightmare was over. He had his daughter back. But he also knew that things would never be the same. He had learned a valuable lesson, a lesson about love, about loss, about the importance of family. He had learned that money and power were meaningless compared to the love of a child. He had almost lost Lily. And he knew that he would do anything, sacrifice anything, to keep her safe. The next morning, Lily woke up, her eyes bright and sparkling. She smiled at Alexander, her face filled with love. "Daddy," she said, reaching out to him. He took her in his arms, holding her close. "I love you, Lily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you too, Daddy," she said. He knew that he would never forget the fear, the desperation, the pain of the past few days. But he also knew that he would never forget the joy, the relief, the love he felt when he found Lily. He had been given a second chance. A second chance to be a father, a second chance to love, a second chance to live. And he wasn't going to waste it. He decided to make some changes in his life. He would still run his company, but he would also make time for Lily. He would be there for her, no matter what. He would be the father she deserved. He also decided to investigate what had happened, to find out who had taken Lily and why. He knew that it wasn't just a random act. Someone had targeted her, had deliberately taken her. And he wouldn't rest until he found out who was responsible and brought them to justice. He started by talking to the police, asking them about their investigation. They told him that they were still looking into it, but they didn't have any leads. Alexander wasn't satisfied with that. He decided to launch his own investigation, using his own resources, his own connections. He hired private investigators, former police officers, and cybersecurity experts. He wanted to leave no stone unturned. He knew that whoever had taken Lily was sophisticated, organized, and probably had inside information. They knew his routine, they knew about Anya, they knew the park. It wasn't a random act. It was planned. As his team delved deeper, they uncovered a web of deceit and betrayal. They discovered that someone close to Alexander, someone he trusted, had been feeding information to the kidnappers. Someone who knew his schedule, his habits, his weaknesses. The realization hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. He had been betrayed. He thought about everyone in his inner circle, his colleagues, his associates, even his friends. Who could it be? Who would do this to him? Who would put Lily in danger? Suspicion fell on several people. There was Julian, his ambitious business partner, who had always been envious of Alexander's success. There was Victoria, a former lover who had threatened revenge after their breakup. And there was even Anya, the nanny, who had seemed so kind and gentle. Could she be involved? Alexander couldn't trust anyone. He felt isolated, paranoid. He didn't know who to believe. He felt like he was living in a nightmare where everyone was a suspect. As the investigation intensified, the pressure mounted. The police were still no closer to finding the kidnappers. Alexander's own team was working around the clock, but they were running out of time. He knew that Lily was in danger. He could feel it in his gut. He started having nightmares. He dreamt of Lily being hurt, of her crying for him, of him being unable to reach her. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, his body trembling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was going to happen. He became obsessed with finding Lily, with bringing her home safe. He neglected his business, his health, his own well-being. All he cared about was Lily. She was his world, his everything. He spent hours going over the evidence, looking for any clue, any detail that could lead him to the kidnappers. He scrutinized security footage, listened to recorded phone calls, and interrogated witnesses. He was determined to find the truth, no matter the cost. The investigation led him down a dark and twisted path, a path filled with danger and deception. He discovered that the kidnappers were not just after money. They had a deeper motive, a more sinister agenda. They were trying to use Lily as leverage, to force Alexander to do something he didn't want to do. He realized that he was caught in a trap set by someone who knew him well, someone who knew his weaknesses, someone who knew how to hurt him. He was being manipulated, played like a pawn in a game he didn't understand. He felt like he was losing control. He was losing his grip on reality. He was losing himself. He knew that he had to act fast. He had to find Lily before it was too late. He had to confront his enemies, expose their secrets, and bring them to justice. He gathered his team, his most trusted advisors, and laid out his plan. He was going to take the fight to the kidnappers. He was going to use all his resources, all his power, all his influence to find Lily and bring her home. He knew that it was a risky plan, a dangerous plan. But he had no choice. He had to do it. He had to save his daughter. He looked at the faces of his team, their faces etched with concern and determination. He knew that they were with him, that they would do anything for him, for Lily. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He was ready to face his enemies, to confront the darkness that threatened to consume him. He was ready to do whatever it took to save his daughter. He knew that the next few hours would be the most crucial of his life. He knew that Lily's life hung in the balance. He knew that. He had to be strong, he had to be brave, he had to be ruthless. He was no longer just Alexander the tech billionaire. He was Alexander, Lily's father. and he would stop at nothing to protect her. He stepped into the darkness, ready to face whatever lay ahead. He was prepared to fight, to kill, to die, if necessary, to bring his daughter home. He would not rest until he had her safe in his arms again. He would not let anyone hurt her. He would not let anyone take her away from him. The climax was approaching. The confrontation was inevitable. The battle was about to begin. And Alexander was ready. He moved like a phantom, his security team flanking him, their movements precise and coordinated. They tracked the signal from Lily's tracking device, a small, unassuming watch she always wore. It led them to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a desolate place filled with shadows and echoes. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the rhythmic thump of Alexander's heart. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, a mix of fear and determination. He was close. He could feel it. They breached the warehouse, weapons drawn, their eyes scanning the darkness. The place was eerily quiet, too quiet. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. Something wasn't right. They moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled on the concrete floor. The tracking signal was getting stronger, leading them deeper into the labyrinthine warehouse. They reached a large, open space in the center of the warehouse. The tracking signal was strongest here. Alexander's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel Lily's presence, close, but not visible. He scanned the room, his eyes searching for any sign of her. And then he saw it. A small, brightly colored backpack, lying on the floor. Lily's backpack. He rushed to it, his hands trembling. He opened it, his heart sinking. Inside, he found Lily's doll, the ragged princess with the missing arm. He picked it up, clutching it to his chest. He felt a wave of despair wash over him. Where was she? Suddenly, a voice echoed through the warehouse, a cold, mocking voice. Looking for something, Alexander? Alexander whirled around, his eyes searching for the source of the voice. He saw a figure emerge from the shadows, a man dressed in black, his face hidden by a mask. Where is she? Alexander demanded, his voice tight with anger. The masked man chuckled. Patience, Alexander, he said. All in good time. Alexander's security team moved to surround the masked man, but he raised his hand, signaling them to stop. I wouldn't do that, he said. I have friends in high places. He gestured to a large screen that had been set up in the corner of the warehouse. The screen flickered to life, revealing a live feed from another location. Alexander's blood ran cold. It was Lily. She was tied to a chair, gagged, her eyes wide with fear. She was in a small, dark room, alone. Hello, Lily, the masked man said, his voice dripping with malice. Lily whimpered, trying to speak, but the gag muffled her cries. Alexander felt a surge of rage so intense it threatened to consume him. He wanted to rip the masked man apart, to tear him limb from limb. But he knew he couldn't. He had to stay calm. He had to think. What do you want? Alexander asked, his voice low and dangerous. The masked man smiled. You know what I want, Alexander, he said. You've known all along. Alexander's mind raced. What did he want? What was he talking about? He thought of all the deals he had made, all the people he had crossed. Who could this be? I want what's rightfully mine, the masked man continued. I want what you stole from me. Alexander's heart sank. He knew what he was talking about now. It was about the project. The Phoenix Project. A revolutionary technology that Alexander had developed years ago, a technology that could change the world. A technology that someone had tried to steal from him. He had thought the threat was gone, that he had dealt with it years ago. But he was wrong. It had come back, stronger than ever. And now they had Lily. You want the Phoenix Project? Alexander asked. The masked man nodded. That's right, he said. And you're going to give it to me. And if I don't? Alexander asked. The masked man smiled again, a cruel, chilling smile. Then Lily suffers, he said. Alexander stared at the screen, at his daughter, tied and gagged, her eyes filled with terror. He couldn't risk it. He couldn't risk her life. Okay, he said, his voice barely a whisper. You win. You get the Phoenix Project. The masked man chuckled. Wise choice, Alexander, he said. But it's not that simple. He gestured to another screen that had just come to life. It showed another live feed, this time from a different location. Alexander's blood ran cold. It was Anya. She was tied to a chair, gagged, her eyes wide with fear. She was in a small, dark room, alone. Anya? Alexander whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. The masked man smiled. Yes, Anya, he said. She's been working for me all along. Alexander stared at the screen, his mind reeling. Anya? The nanny? The woman he had trusted with his daughter? She was part of this? He felt a wave of betrayal wash over him, a betrayal so deep it cut him to the core. He had been so blind, so naive. He had trusted the wrong people. She gave us access to your house, the masked man continued. She told us about Lily's watch. She made it all possible. Alexander felt a surge of anger, a rage so intense it threatened to explode. He had been played for a fool. He had been manipulated, betrayed by the very people he had trusted. You're going to give me the Phoenix Project, the masked man said, and you're going to do it willingly. If you try to resist, if you try to call the police, if you try to do anything, Lily and Anya will die. Alexander stared at the two screens, at his daughter and her nanny, both tied and gagged, both at the mercy of this masked man. He was trapped. He had no way out. He knew what he had to do. He had to give them the Phoenix Project. He had to save Lily and Anya. But he also knew that giving them the Phoenix Project would be a mistake. It would be dangerous. It would put the world at risk. He was caught between a rock and a hard place. He had to make a choice. A choice that would determine the fate of his daughter, the fate of Anya, and perhaps even the fate of the world. And he had to make that choice now. Alexander's mind raced. He was trapped. He had to make a choice no parent should ever have to make. His daughter's life, Anya's life, the fate of the world. All rested on his shoulders. He looked at Lily on the screen, her eyes wide with fear, silently pleading with him. He looked at Anya, her face pale and drawn, a mask of terror. He knew what he had to do. Okay, he said, his voice barely a whisper. You win. You get the Phoenix Project. The masked man chuckled, a sound that grated on Alexander's nerves. Excellent, he said. Now here's the deal. You're going to transfer the access codes to me. Then, and only then, will I release Lily and Anya. Alexander nodded. Agreed, he said. He knew he had to play along, at least for now. He couldn't risk anything happening to Lily. He turned to his head of security, Dmitri. Dmitri, he said, his voice low, get me a secure line. I need to access my systems. Dmitri nodded, his face grim. He knew what Alexander was doing. He knew the risks. But he also knew that they had no choice. Alexander sat down at a console, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He accessed his secure servers, the ones that housed the Phoenix Project. He could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was about to hand over a technology that could change everything, a technology that could be used for good or for evil. He typed in the access codes, his heart pounding in his chest. He watched as the codes were transferred, his eyes glued to the screen. He felt a sense of dread, a feeling that he was making a terrible mistake. The transfer was complete. The masked man? Had the codes. Good, the masked man said. Now, as promised, I'll release your little girl and her accomplice. He snapped his fingers, and the screen showing Lily and Anya went blank. Alexander's heart skipped a beat. He waited, his breath held tight in his chest. A few minutes later, the door to the warehouse opened, and Lily ran in, her face streaked with tears. She ran straight to Alexander, throwing her arms around him. "Daddy!" she cried. He held her tight, burying his face in her hair. "I'm here, baby," he whispered. "I'm here. I'll never leave you again." Anya followed close behind, her face still pale, but her eyes filled with relief. She nodded to Alexander, a silent thank you. Alexander held Lily close, his eyes never leaving her. He was so relieved to have her back, safe and sound. But he knew that it wasn't over. The masked man still had the Phoenix Project. He still posed a threat. "Now, if you'll excuse me," the masked man said, "I have what I came for." He turned to leave, but Alexander stopped him. "Not so fast," Alexander said, his voice suddenly hard. The masked man stopped, turning back to face him. "What do you mean?" he asked. Alexander smiled, a cold, chilling smile. "You think you've won?" he asked. "You think you've outsmarted me?" The masked man looked confused. "What are you talking about?" he asked. Alexander gestured to the console where he had transferred the access codes. "Those codes," he said, "they were useless." The masked man's eyes widened in shock. "What?" he said. "The Phoenix Project," Alexander continued, "it's not just a technology. It's a system. A complex system with multiple layers of security. Those codes you have, they only give you access to a small part of it. You need more. You need the master key." The masked man's face paled. "The master key?" he whispered. "That's right," Alexander said. "And I'm the only one who has it." The masked man's anger flared. "You tricked me!" he shouted. "You tricked me first," Alexander replied. "You took my daughter. You threatened her life. You thought you could get away with it." The masked man lunged at Alexander, but Dmitri and his team quickly subdued him. They wrestled him to the ground, handcuffing him. "You're under arrest," Dmitri said. Alexander watched as the masked man was taken away, his face filled with rage and frustration. He had won. He had saved Lily. He had protected the Phoenix Project. But as he looked at Lily, holding her close, he realized something. He recognized the masked man's eyes, even though they were hidden behind the mask. He knew who he was. It was someone he had trusted, someone close to him. It was Julian, his business partner. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Julian had betrayed him. He had tried to steal the Phoenix Project. He had put Lily's life in danger. He had been working against him all along. But why? Why would Julian do this? What was his motive? As the police led Julian away, Alexander caught his eye. Julian looked at him, his face filled with hatred. And then, he whispered something that sent a chill down Alexander's spine. "It's not over, Alexander," he whispered. "There's someone else." Alexander's blood ran cold. Someone else? What did he mean? He looked at Lily, who was snuggled in his arms, her eyes closed, finally asleep. He had saved her, but he knew that the danger was not over. There was still someone out there, someone who wanted the Phoenix Project, someone who was willing to do anything to get it. And he knew that this person would not stop until they had what they wanted. The climax had passed, the immediate threat neutralized. But a new, even more terrifying mystery had emerged. The real mastermind was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike. And Alexander knew, with a chilling certainty, that his fight was far from over. The real battle was just beginning. Alexander held Lily close, his heart heavy with a newfound sense of dread. Julian's words echoed in his mind, "There's someone else." He looked at his daughter, sleeping peacefully in his arms, oblivious to the danger that still lurked. He had saved her from Julian, but the real mastermind was still out there, pulling the strings from the shadows. He knew he couldn't rest, not yet. The fight was far from over. He took Lily home, tucking her into bed. He watched her sleep, her face serene and innocent. He vowed to protect her, to keep her safe from harm. He would not let anyone hurt her again. He called Dmitri and his team, briefing them on Julian's cryptic message. "There's someone else," he repeated, his voice grim. "We need to find out who it is." Dmitri nodded. "We'll find them, Mr. Sterling," he said. "We'll leave no stone unturned." The investigation began anew, this time focusing on Julian's connections, his associates, his past. They delved into his financial records, his communications, his every move. They were looking for any clue, any hint, any indication of who the someone else could be. As they dug deeper, they uncovered a trail of deceit and corruption, a web of lies that stretched far beyond Julian. They discovered that Julian was just a pawn in a much larger game, a game played by powerful people, people who were willing to do anything to get what they wanted. They discovered a secret organization, a shadowy group known only as the Syndicate. This group was involved in everything from corporate espionage to arms trafficking, and they had their eyes set on the Phoenix Project. Alexander realized that he was dealing with something much bigger than he had imagined. He was up against a powerful and dangerous organization, an organization that had the resources and the influence to make his life a living hell. He knew that he had to be careful. He couldn't trust anyone. He was surrounded by enemies, people who were pretending to be his friends, people who were waiting for the right moment to strike. He thought of Anya. She had betrayed him, but he couldn't bring himself to hate her. He knew that she had been forced to do it, that she had been threatened. He decided to let her go, to give her a second chance. He hoped that she would learn from her mistakes and that she would find a way to redeem herself. He focused all his energy on finding the leader of the syndicate, the person who was pulling the strings. He knew that if he could find them, he could stop them. He could put an end to this nightmare. The investigation led them to a hidden offshore account, a bank account that was linked to the syndicate. They traced the account to a series of shell companies, each one more obscure than the last. They were getting closer, but they were still far from the truth. As they continued to investigate, they discovered that the syndicate had infiltrated his company, that they had planted moles in his organization. These moles were feeding them information, sabotaging his efforts, and trying to steal the Phoenix Project. Alexander felt a sense of betrayal, a feeling that he had been violated. He had trusted these people, he had worked with them, he had considered them his friends. And they had betrayed him. He knew that he had to clean house, that he had to get rid of the moles before they could do any more damage. He worked with Dmitri and his team to identify the moles, to expose them, and to remove them from his company. It was a difficult and painful process. He had to fire people he had known for years, people he had trusted. But he had no choice. He had to protect his company, he had to protect the Phoenix Project, and he had to protect Lily. As he was dealing with the moles within his company, he received a message from an anonymous source. The message contained information about the leader of the syndicate, their identity, their location, their plans. Alexander read the message, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe what he was reading. The leader of the syndicate was someone he knew, someone he had worked with for years. It was Victor, his closest advisor, his confidant, the man he had trusted more than anyone else. The revelation hit him like a ton of bricks. Victor? The man he had considered his friend? The man who had been by his side through thick and thin? He was the leader of the syndicate. He felt a wave of anger, a rage so intense it threatened to consume him. He had been betrayed by the one person he had trusted most. He knew that he had to confront Victor, that he had to bring him to justice. He gathered his team, preparing for the final showdown. They tracked Victor to a remote island in the Caribbean, a private island where he had built his empire. Alexander and his team flew to the island, ready to confront him. They stormed the island, their weapons drawn, their faces grim. They found Victor in his luxurious villa, surrounded by his guards. A fierce battle ensued. Alexander and his team fought their way through the guards, determined to reach Victor. They were outnumbered, but they were determined to win. Finally, they reached Victor. He was standing on a balcony, overlooking the ocean, his face calm and composed. "Victor," Alexander said, his voice hard. "It's over." Victor turned to face him, his face expressionless. "Is it, Alexander?" he asked. He gestured to a screen that had been set up on the balcony. The screen flickered to life, revealing a live feed from another location. Alexander's blood ran cold. It was Lily. She was tied to a chair, gagged, her eyes wide with fear. She was in a small, dark room, alone. "You didn't think I would forget about her, did you?" Victor asked, his voice cold. Alexander felt a surge of rage, a rage so intense it threatened to explode. He wanted to kill Victor, to tear him limb from limb. But he knew he couldn't. "Not yet." "What do you want, Victor?" Alexander asked, his voice low and dangerous. Victor smiled. "I want the Phoenix Project, Alexander," he said. "And I want you to give it to me willingly." Alexander stared at the screen, at his daughter, tied and gagged, her eyes filled with terror. He couldn't risk it. He couldn't risk her life. "Okay," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You win. You get the Phoenix Project." Victor chuckled. "Wise choice, Alexander," he said. "Now, here's the deal. You're going to transfer the master key to me. Then, and only then, will I release Lily." Alexander nodded. "Agreed," he said. He knew he had to play along, at least for now. He couldn't risk anything happening to Lily. He turned to his head of security, Dmitri. "Dmitri," he said, his voice low, "get me a secure line. I need to access my systems." Dmitri nodded, his face grim. He knew what Alexander was doing. He knew the risks. But he also knew that they had no choice. Alexander sat down at a console, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He accessed his secure servers, the ones that housed the Phoenix Project. He could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was about to hand over the master key, the key that could unlock the secrets of the Phoenix Project. He typed in the access codes, his heart pounding in his chest. He watched as the codes were transferred, his eyes glued to the screen. He felt a sense of dread, a feeling that he was making a terrible mistake. The transfer was complete. Victor had the master key. "Good," Victor said. "Now, as promised, I'll release your little girl." He snapped his fingers, and the screen showing Lily went blank. Alexander's heart skipped a beat. He waited, his breath held tight in his chest. A few minutes later, the door to the room where Lily was being held opened, and she ran in, her face streaked with tears. She ran straight to Alexander, throwing her arms around him. "Daddy!" she cried. He held her tight, burying his face in her hair. "I'm here, baby," he whispered. "I'm here. I'll never leave you again." He held her close, his eyes never leaving her. He was so relieved to have her back, safe and sound. But he knew that it wasn't over. Victor still had the Phoenix Project. He still posed a threat. "Now, if you'll excuse me," Victor said, "I have what I came for." He turned to leave, but Alexander stopped him. "Not so fast," Alexander said, his voice suddenly hard. Victor stopped, turning back to face him. "What do you mean?" he asked. Alexander smiled, a cold,